Everyone thinks they know how Rome fell. They'll tell you it happened back in 476 AD when the Germanic Theodoric the Great deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, sending him off to a monastery with a pension. And while that date is significant for reasons we'll discuss later, it was just the last in a long line of symptoms that had been plaguing the empire for centuries before that. A good way to understand why Rome collapsed would be to think of it less as falling and more like unraveling. We can pick out key moments in its history and assign blame to things like barbarian invasions or economic crises or corrupt emperors. But what those things really are is symptoms of larger problems within the empire that had been growing since the 3rd century. By the time of Romulus Augustulus, these issues were so bad that even he didn't bother pretending to be emperor. Instead, he farmed the title out to his father, a Roman general of Germanic origin who was busy trying to hold the Northwest together against those same barbarians. So the year 476 is significant because it marked the end of the pretense. From that point on, the various regions of the old Roman world would be ruled by different Germanic kingdoms, but also by the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, and no one would bother pretending that any of them were all part of the same thing anymore. But that doesn't mean it had to be this way. Let's go back to the middle of the 3rd century, which scholars considered to be the real turning point for Rome. At the time, the empire was being threatened by a combination of external and internal pressures. On the outside, there was a lot of fighting along the Danube with the Goths, who were a group of people historically associated with what we today call Scandinavia. And if that sounds strange, let me clarify that back then. Scandinavia wasn't a place. It was a word people used to describe themselves, sort of like how the Romans called themselves Italian. Anyway, the Goths had been pushed into the Balkans by other nomadic groups to the north and east, and although they weren't able to conquer Rome territory, they did manage to sack several cities, including the imperial capital of Rome in 258, a rare event that deeply humiliated Rome. To make matters worse, the Gothic king at the time, managed to make a deal with Rome's other enemies, including the Franks, the Alemanni, and others, uniting the various barbarian tribes in opposition to Rome for the first time. To top it all off, there was a massive economic crisis caused by years of inflation and overspending. By some accounts, prices between 235 and 284 more than doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled. According to Cassius Dio, a Roman historian, bread, wine, meat, and even gold coins became practically worthless. That was especially bad because the value of money was tied to its weight in gold and silver, so the currency literally began to break apart in your hands. Now, there are a number of reasons for all these problems. For example, the monetary crisis may have been caused by decades of war that required Rome to spend a lot of money on armies and mercenaries. Or maybe it was caused by an overestimation of how much gold and silver Rome actually had in circulation, which made it seem like there was more money around than there really was. Whatever the cause, though, the effect was the same. Rome was having trouble paying its soldiers, collecting taxes, and defending its borders. And yet, despite all these problems, the empire managed to make it through the crisis of the 3rd century and emerged stronger than ever. Well, the answer was a series of reforms. First, in 284, the Emperor Carus reorganized the administration and tax collection system and issued new coins. Then after Carus died on campaign, his son, the Emperor Nu, worked to stabilize the borders and make peace with the Goths by offering them land in exchange for their military service. Finally, after Nu, his successor Constantius I finished the job by defeating the Franks and consolidating the empire's defense along the Rhine. After all that, the economy recovered, the borders stabilized, and the empire enjoyed 2 centuries of peace and prosperity known as the Dominate. During this time, the empire thrived economically, militarily, and culturally. In fact, during the reign of Diocletian from 284 to 305, the empire grew so wealthy that it could afford to cut taxes. And by the time of Constantine the Great in the early 4th century, it had become so powerful that it was able to fight back against the Sasanian Persians and win. It was also during the Dominates that Christianity went from being a persecuted cult to being an official religion of the Roman state. So you might be thinking, wait a minute, if Rome was doing so well in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, how did it eventually fall apart? Well, the thing is, it never did. At least not in the way that most people think. The reason you've heard about a date like 476 is because the period that followed in Europe is generally referred to as the Middle Ages. And the idea is that Middle Ages were preceded by a period of classical antiquity that ended with the fall of Rome. But here's where things get weird. While it's true that after 476 AD, there were no longer any Roman emperors ruling in the West, that didn't mean that Rome had fallen. There was still a Roman emperor in the East, and that continued to be the case until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans. And that's why scholars are increasingly abandoning the phrase fall of Rome altogether in favor of something like transformation of Rome. This is all pretty confusing. So let me sum it up. Despite all its problems, Rome managed to pull itself together and enjoy a couple centuries of peace and prosperity, longer than any peace or prosperity Rome had seen since the days of Augustus. Even when the empire was divided and barbarian kings roamed the former western provinces, Rome continued on in the east, even taking back some of the old territories on the Mediterranean coast. Scholars continue to argue about whether the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the Western Roman Empire. But the truth is, it doesn't matter. The people of the Eastern Empire considered themselves to be Romans, and that's what counts. What do you think? Do you have any other theories about the fall of Rome? Share them below, and thanks for watching.